everyone, and welcome back to the Critter Corner. Today I'm going to be talking about African fattail care, giving a little African fattail gecko care guide with also some of my experiences with my African fattail, because if you don't have one or don't know, every single keeper that I know have had some issues. They can be more picky than leopard geckos, they can have some health issues. So we're going to talk about all that in this video, starting out with some basics on their care. So African fattail geckos as adults are around 55 grams, but they can get up to 75 grams depending on the individual. And they also are about 7 to 8 inches long, full grown. These geckos are terrestrial, meaning they need a more long enclosure than tall. They are on the ground. They don't climb very much. They're not arboreal or anything. They are terrestrial geckos. So they will walk on the ground. They don't stick to walls or anything like some other geckos. But yes, they are from West Africa. They typically live in termite mounds, so on clay, in dirt, in sand. This is an example of a African fattail gecko's native habitat. As far as behavior goes, African fattail geckos are very docile, very sweet. They are very slow moving compared to leopard geckos. My African fattail gecko is not very skittish. He's kind of just chill, and they move pretty slow, and they're very sweet. Additionally, these geckos are crepuscular, meaning they are out at dawn and dusk. Mine comes out just like that, at dawn and dusk. So about when the lights go off, he'll come out for like an hour or two, and then also in the morning sometimes I'll see him out. But similar to leopard geckos, they are crepuscular. So you may be wondering, what's the difference between an African fattail gecko and a leopard gecko? And besides parts of their care, which we are going to get to, leopard geckos are much longer with skinnier bodies, and African fattail geckos are much shorter with a little bit of a wider body. They also come in different morphs. African fattails you will often find with some bands on them, sometimes with that dorsal stripe down the middle, and leopard geckos you will find often with like kind of leopard spots. So yeah, as far as behavior goes, they also act very different. Although both are really good beginner pets and can be very sweet, leopard geckos are much faster and more skittish in my opinion, and African fattail geckos are slower and more tame. So now that you know a little bit more about African fattail geckos, let's talk about how you would care for them. Starting off with the enclosure size, for an adult African fattail gecko, you are going to need a 40-gallon enclosure. This enclosure needs to be 36 inches long, 18 inches wide, and 18 inches tall. That is the minimum for an adult African fattail gecko. Now, as babies, you can house them in something smaller, a 20-gallon, but you are going to need to upgrade them. So personally, I like to start with a 40-gallon, keeping them on paper towels when they're babies, and then more decorating their enclosure and everything when they're adults. But the minimum for an adult African fattail gecko is a 40-gallon enclosure. Now, when we talk about enclosure, I want to talk about them using the space. Do they use all of this space? And the answer is yes, they will. But you might not always see them. So as I talked about before, they come out at dawn and dusk, and mine will be out at night a lot of the time. So I might not see him using the whole enclosure, but he definitely does. I see poop in one corner, his food eaten from another corner, him basking in another corner. They will use the entire enclosure. So they need to have a 40-gallon enclosure at least. They also will display some natural behaviors in this enclosure, like basking, digging, using their humid hide, using their calcium dish. We will get to all of that in the next category, but they will use the entire space. So please give it to them. As far as the type of enclosure, you can have a PVC or glass enclosure. These are a little bit higher humidity than leopard geckos, so PVC would work great. I have a glass enclosure and it is front opening. I highly suggest front opening for any reptile, because then they can see you coming in to grab them, rather than you coming from the top like a predator. Now let's talk about what they will need in this enclosure. So in their enclosure, they will need at least 3 hides: a cold hide, hot hide, and humid hide. I suggest having more than 3 hides, but this is the bare minimum. The hot hide will be over on the warm side under the basking lamp or near the basking lamp. They will also need a basking spot on that side. And the cold hide will be on the other side of the enclosure on the cool side. And then the humid hide will be somewhere in the middle as a humid hide so they can get humidity to shed. I'm going to show you what all of this looks like in the enclosure so you can see the full picture. So in his enclosure, he has all 3 of those hides. He actually has 3 hides over on this cool side. He has this hide in the middle that's kind of in between warm and cool. He has this side on the warmer side. This is a tire that he'll hide in. He has his humid hide right here and then his hot hide right here. A good humid hide is something that is fully enclosed and has something in it to stay humid. I have Eco Earth in mine because it stays humid very well. And as you can see, it's also bioactive. So there's a bunch of springtails in there. I'll talk about bioactiveness later. But this is Miko's humid hide. It has the lid on it and everything. This one is an Exoterra one. Additional things that are necessary in the enclosure are a water dish. This one has some gnats in it right now. I need to clean it out. But I love to give mine water dishes that they can fully climb into because they will use it. They will like climb in it and stuff. And some of mine like to sit in it and drink. But that's just what I prefer. It's not necessary that they can fit inside the water dish. And then they also have a calcium dish. This is calcium without D3. It's necessary to have in their enclosures at all times. They will use it when they feel they are low on calcium. They'll take some licks and bites of it. So I forgot to talk about the most important thing, which is substrate. So I had to run down to the reptile room real quick to film this while I was editing. But substrate is basically what your reptile walks on. So it could be paper towels, dirt, clay, sand, anything like that is the substrate. As far as what an African fat-tailed gecko needs, they are a more humid species. So what I do currently for mine is 60% organic topsoil, 10% excavator clay, and 30% play sand. So since they're more humid, 60% topsoil, 30% play sand, the rest of the 10% I do clay. This I found is a really good mixture and it's close to their natural habitat. Since they are more humid, the topsoil and clay keep in the humidity pretty well. I also added leaf litter and moss on top of that substrate for my isopods. But I wanted to talk about also substrates that are absolutely not okay. That would be sand on its own and also calcium sand. Both, no, they're a no-go. Sand on its own is very dusty and not great for human species. Calcium sand, on the other hand, is just completely deadly. Calcium sand is it's like made of calcium, and reptiles like calcium, so they'll eat the substrate on purpose and get impaction. Impaction is basically when stuff gets stuck in their stomach. If you have a safe mixture of substrate in the correct temperatures, your reptile won't get impaction even if they eat some substrate. It's normal for them to get substrate in their mouth, but in order for them to pass that substrate, you need proper care, proper conditions, proper heat, humidity, and proper substrate. One more thing that people always ask me about is reptile carpet. Reptile carpet, also a no-go. Don't do it. It is just carpet that gets stuck to everything. Their teeth can get stuck to it. Their nails can get stuck to it. They can rip out their nails, rip out their teeth, get really, really injured from it, and it's not worth it. It also harbors bacteria. If you're using paper towels, you're going to replace those. I replace mine every other day. The reptile carpet, if you replace that every other day, that's going to get expensive, and it's also gross. Just use paper towels. It's so much cheaper, so much easier than reptile carpet. But that's my little rant on that. Now that we've talked about substrate, let's talk about things that you can put in the substrate, like isopods and springtails. I'm going to show my bioactive enclosure, but basically I keep powdered orange isopods in there. Isopods will eat any poop and waste, and then I have springtails. Springtails will eat any mold and bacteria and everything. And also decaying isopods, your springtails will eat those too. If you are going for a bioactive enclosure, it's necessary to have moss and leaf litter on top of your substrate. Your isopods and springtails will eat this, and they'll also hide in it. And then I also have live plants and a drainage layer. There's a ton of different reptile safe plants. The ones I use in this enclosure are pothos and bromeliads. They have been growing great, and these are more humid plants, but I will link a reptile safe plant list below if you want to check it out. So as far as temperatures goes, you're going to really have 3 different ranges. You're going to have your basking spot temp, cold side temp, and warm side temp. My basking spot, I like to keep between 90 and 95 degrees. My rule of thumb for basking is it's too hot if you can't hold your hand on it for a significant amount of time. I'm talking like a minute. Like if you can't hold your hand on it, it's way too hot. But I keep a thermometer under the basking spot, and then also I have a temp gun that I use to measure the temperatures, but basking between 90 and 95 degrees. Warm side, I like to keep between 80 and 85 degrees. Cool side, I like to keep between 70 and 75 degrees, with the nighttime temperatures getting as low as 68 degrees, but nighttime doesn't really get below 68 degrees. So those are all the temperatures I have in my enclosure. Temperature should be a gradient. These, if your temperatures are not exactly between these ranges, it's okay. Don't base your care solely off of my care guide, but this is what works for me and what I found is the most obtainable and works best for my gecko. I want to show what my temp gun looks like. This is just from Amazon. I think I just searched temperature gun, and it has a laser that basically it points to the spot you're measuring the temperature, and then it'll say it is 88 degrees on my hand. So I'm gonna, yeah, it has the temperature and the absolute minimum temperature. You can set it to like max temperature, but this is very, very helpful in measuring certain spots in your enclosure, because if you have like a thermometer that's sitting there or like on the wall, it's not gonna get the entire enclosure. So this is great for measuring cool side, warm side, basking spot, all of that, and also a great backup option if your thermometer breaks or anything. So next, let's talk about humidity. This is also going to be a gradient. Under the basking spot, mine drops to as low as 30% humidity. This is not the humidity of the entire enclosure at all. This is just under the basking spot. Because you're having a heat lamp directly on slate, it's going to get dry no matter what. So under the basking spot, it can get as low as 30. I try to keep it between 30 and 40 under the basking spot. On the cold side, it's going to be between 50 and 60% humidity. And then the middle is that same range, 50 to 55 kind of. It really is a gradient. So 60, 40, 50 pretty much is how it goes in his enclosure. But he also has a humid hide. So let's talk about lighting. I have 3 lights on my African fat-tailed gecko's enclosure. 2 of them are essential. 1 of them is optional. It depends what kind of enclosure you're going for. Number 1, a halogen bulb. This is essential. As far as heat goes, to get those temperatures we talked about earlier, you should be using a halogen bulb. Do not use heat mats. Heat mats can be very dangerous. They can burn your reptiles. They can catch fire. They can malfunction. A lot of problems with heat mats. Same thing with heat rocks. Don't use them. Halogen bulbs provide the right light spectrum and everything to get your gecko everything they need. Another option is a deep heat projector, but it's not as great as a halogen bulb. But if you are needing any nighttime heat, use a deep heat projector if it gets like super, super cold in your house. But like I said, night drops are natural. So if your house gets below 65 degrees, that's when you would want to get a deep heat projector. Now, UVB. UVB has been controversial in the reptile community. It is essential for all reptiles. All reptiles benefit from UVB no matter what time of the day they're out. Natural sunlight, sun rays, UVB rays, I don't know too much about the science, but they need it. Sunlight is in the wild. You get so many benefits from sunlight. Your reptile should have it too. UVB lighting is necessary. It's not an option, it's necessary. As far as brands go, I love Arcadia. I've heard ReptiSun is really good too, but I've never tried them myself. But I use the Arcadia T5 7% bulb for my reptile. I also wanted to say UVB doesn't give off any heat, so you don't need a dimmer or anything. It just is a light. It doesn't really give off any heat. Finally, a grow light. I have a grow light in my enclosure because my enclosure is bioactive. That means I have isopods and springtails and live plants in there to keep the enclosure self-sustaining. For the most part, you still need to clean up in bioactive enclosures. But my plants need a light to grow. So I have an Arcadia Jungle Dawn grow light in my enclosure. It is really expensive, but really great. I really recommend any other grow light. I think this one is super awesome. Okay, and finally, I want to talk about some issues I've had or things to keep in mind before you get an African fat-tailed gecko. These are things that I would say for all baby geckos, but specifically, this was an issue when I got my African fat-tailed gecko. If you are getting a baby or basically any new animal, you need to quarantine them. Keep them on paper towels. Do not put them directly on loose substrate. I know, especially with rescues, you really want to give them the care they deserve. I understand that, but paper towels are necessary to track your reptile's health for the first couple weeks you have them. After you are sure they're healthy, you can move them to loose substrate, but it is so important to quarantine your reptiles. I had my African fat-tailed gecko on paper towels, but I had moss in his humid hide, and that was not a good idea. I should have had paper towels in his humid hide, and I ended up doing that after. But basically what happened was he was eating the moss and he wasn't really basking because he was a baby and he didn't understand it really. And I had trouble getting him to bask, so he wasn't getting the proper heat and he got impaction from eating that moss. I mean, it was my fault, but like I thought I had everything right, and he stopped pooping, he stopped eating. This went on for a while, about a month. He wasn't really eating and he was really small. He was a baby. I was really worried. And then I put him in a really small quarantine tub, probably like this big. It was this big, pretty small. I put him in that quarantine tub, which you should do for babies. I shouldn't have put my baby in his 40-gallon right away. I put him in a little tub after I realized my mistake with just a hide, a basking spot, and a humid hide, and then his food dish and water dish and everything, and calcium. And then he eventually pooped out the biggest poop I've ever seen of like pretty much just moss. He did 3 of those big poops, and then he was finally cleared from impaction and he started eating again. Another thing is African fat-tailed geckos can be very picky eaters in general. Something that I've had to do with mine, and I still have to do, is I have to cut off the head to his worms or pretty much any insect before he eats them. And I have to drip the juice on his nose, have him lick it up, and then he'll eat the worm. This is something I've had to do since I got him. I know a lot of people that have to do that. So that is something to keep in mind. They can be fussy eaters. Mine has never eaten out of a dish on his own, and he's almost a year old. So something to keep in mind. Always just things I wish I knew more about before I got him. Another thing is that they are very shy. I wouldn't say they don't have personalities, but they can be kind of boring to someone that wants a very exciting reptile. When I hold him, he pretty much just sits there. He won't move around a ton, and they are not skittish, but they're very shy. If you're looking for a reptile with tons and tons of personality, African fat-tailed geckos may not be the best fit for you. They are so lovely and so sweet, but they're not the most exciting reptile in the world. African fat-tailed geckos can also drop their tail. If you've seen with other geckos, crested geckos, they drop their tail and don't grow it back. African fat-tailed geckos drop their tail and they can grow it back. It just looks kind of not right. It just looks kind of carroty. But African fat-tailed geckos can drop their tail. If you're pulling on their tail, if something gets stuck on their tail, they may drop it. I hope you learned something about African fat-tailed geckos today. I tried to put as much information as I could into this video. If you have any questions about African fat-tailed geckos, comment them down below and I will answer them. I wanted to also say, do not use this as your only care guide. Definitely do more research before getting an animal. Multiple care guides, tons of research. Definitely make sure you know what you're doing, because I am not the African fat-tail expert of all time. I've had mine for a while. I know a lot about them, but this is not an end-all be-all. I just know African fat-tails don't have a ton of care guides out there. So thank you so much for watching, everyone, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye!